Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Alton, and I am the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's virtual authors talk. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, exhibitions, and other historical programs, advocating preservation, and providing resources to classrooms. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done this work from its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark finished in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson in Washington, D.C. Today's author's talk features historian Dr. Richard Middleton discussing his new biography, Cornwallis, Soldier and Statesman in a Revolutionary World. Charles Cornwallis was a leading figure in the late 18th century Great Britain. His career spanned the American War of Independence, the Irish Union, the French Revolutionary Wars, and the building of the Second British Empire in India. Focusing on the first section of his new biography, Cornwallis, Soldier and Statesman in a Revolutionary World, Dr. Richard Middleton offers insight into Cornwallis's time in America and argues that Cornwallis's legacy during the Revolutionary War is significantly more complex than the shortcomings he is most often associated with. Richard Middleton is an independent scholar and was formerly an associate professor of American history at Queen's University, Belfast. He earned his Ph.D. from the University of Exeter and is the author of The Bells of Victory, the Pitt Newcastle Ministry, and the Conduct of the 7 Years' War, 1757 to 1762, published in 1985, Colonial America, a History, 1565 to 1776, published in 2002, Amherst and the Conquest of Canada, selected papers from the Correspondence of Major Jeffery Amherst, while Commander-in-Chief in North America from September 1758 to December 1760, published in 2003. Pontiac's War, Its Causes, Course, and Consequences, 1763 to 1765, published in 2007. And The War of American Independence, 1775 to 1783, published in 2011. Following today's talk, there will be a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit questions for Dr. Middleton using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. And now, without further delay, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Richard Middleton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for those kind comments, and for the chance to address the distinguished members of the Society of the Cincinnati on the subject of my recently published biography of Charles Lord Cornwallis. I'm aware, metaphorically speaking, of putting my head into the lion's den in addressing you on this topic, given your historic relationship with the officers of George Washington's army. However, even the opponents of the American cause deserve a hearing, if only to understand, if not condone, their conduct. Well, first, a few words about Cornwallis's background in education. He was born on the 31st December 1737 in Grosvenor Square, London, not far from St. James's Palace in the heart of fashionable Mayfair. His father, the first Earl, was a member of the Privy Council, while his mother was a daughter of Lord Townshend, head of one of the most politically powerful families in the Whig Party. Among other relatives present at his christening and acting as a godparent was Thomas Pelham Hollis, Duke of Newcastle, future First Minister of George II. Cornwallis thus arrived in the world with the proverbial silver spoon in his mouth, as his early life certainly demonstrated. After education at home by private tutors, he was sent to Eton around 8 years of age, where he stayed until he was about 16, when he enrolled as a student at Clare College, Cambridge University. However, he did not complete his degree, since, as he later told his son Charles, he had from an early stage been actuated by an irresistible impulse to be a soldier. He may have been influenced in his decision by his uncle, Edward Cornwallis, then a Major General in the British Army. But military service was in any case a typical route for the heirs of the nobility to follow until they inherited their father's titles and estates. Whatever the source of this motivation, to be a soldier. The records show that in December 1756, he obtained an ensign's commission in the prestigious First Foot or Grenadier Guards, which his father had purchased for him. Most officer entrants to the service normally joined a regiment to learn the craft of soldiering from their more senior colleagues and experienced non-commissioned personnel. A few of the more ambitious entrants might read Humphrey Bland's Treatise of Military Discipline or works of military history like Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. But undoubtedly most officers preferred to devote their leisure hours socializing at their clubs where they could gamble, drink, and womanize if they so wished. This was probably one reason why the first Earl decided that his son should have a more rigorous military education by sending him to a military college at Turin in Italy in the company of an experienced Prussian officer, Captain Rogan. However, his studies were cut short by the outbreak of the 7 Years' War in Europe, which prompted Cornwallis to seek service as a volunteer with the British forces then in Germany. Here he saw combat in a number of engagements, first as an aide to Lord Granby with the British cavalry, and then from 1759 as a captain in the newly formed 85th Foot Regiment, before being promoted in June 1761 to the lieutenant colonelcy of the 12th Foot Regiment. Well, such rapid promotion was, of course, a testimony to his aristocratic connections, the silver spoon that I mentioned earlier. However, his father nevertheless affirmed to Cornwallis's younger brother, William, then about to enter the Navy, the key to promotion was to be respected by superior colleagues. Your brother is known to every general in the army he serves in and has a universal good word and approbation. This had helped him to be a lieutenant colonel very young and would carry him even further to general applause. At the ending of the war in 1762 coincided with the death of Cornwallis's father and therefore his own elevation to the House of Lords. Here, Cornwallis was immediately pitched into controversy concerning the peace terms, not least because his godfather, the Duke of Newcastle, and other grandees of the Whig party believed the settlement negotiated by the Ministry of Lord Bute were inadequate. This attempt to form an opposition proved fruitless, but Cornwallis's loyalty to the Whig cause was rewarded 2 years later, when the party or the Whigs were restored to office under Lord Rockingham. Now, among the measures, of course, of the Rockinghams was the repeal of the famous Stamp Act. But Cornwallis went further in being one of 5 lords who also opposed the government's accompanying Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's right to pass laws binding the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. Now, this action by Cornwallis has been taken by historians as evidence that he was sympathetic to the American cause and was to remain so right up to the outbreak of the War for Independence. But I think the question here is this true? Well, the record after 1766 in fact suggests otherwise. Firstly, Cornwallis did not leave office when the Rockingham ministry, the Whig ministry, was dismissed in August 1766. Instead, he accepted a number of largely non-political officers from Rockingham's successors, the Duke of Grafton and Lord North, and Cornwallis consistently supported thereafter their measures regarding America, voting notably for the Intolerable Act of 1774 and the Act for Restraining the Trade with New England in 1775. Like most Britons, Cornwallis believed the British Constitution offered the colonists the best possible system of governance, incorporating a judicious Aristotelian balance of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. The colonists, therefore, were simply being selfish and disloyal in refusing to contribute to the cost of defending the empire. Nevertheless, Cornwallis did not blame the mass of the population, But like the rest of the British ruling class, he believed that the colonists, the population, had been subverted from their natural fidelity by the wiles of a few malcontents. Now, the capture of these wicked leaders, therefore, was surely all that was required to restore order. And it was a view that the British, Cornwallis and the British, would retain for the rest of the war. However, before looking at Cornwallis' arrival in America, I want to just mention a few details about his military career in the interwar period. Most important, I think, was his appointment in 1766 to be colonel of the 33rd Foot Regiment. This was not one of the most prestigious units in the British Army. However, like many or others, some other officers similarly placed, he determined to compensate for this lack of an elite corps by making the 33rd the best regiment, best infantry, and best trained regiment in the country. The corps certainly needed improvement, according to one of its officers then doing duty on the island of Minorca. Nevertheless, 4 years later, 5 years later, in fact, Cornwallis appears to have achieved his objective. When the newspapers reported in June 1771 that the 33rd Regiment had been twice reviewed at the particular request of the King, first on Blackheath and then in Hyde Park, where they again exhibited all their movements as light infantry. The paper continued, "Their quickness of motion and marching and various order of firing is really astonishing." And then once back before the King, they formed in an instant the Indian file and fired in ambuscade. 2 days later, the newspapers noted that the Guards were to try out the new exercises introduced by Lord Cornwallis with the 33rd Regiment, now deemed the best regiment in the army. It's unclear why Cornwallis adopted such tactics for the whole of his regiment. The light infantry normally comprised only one company per regiment. As an elite group, their role was to provide flanking parties, undertake reconnaissance, and execute other dangerous assignments. Such training could clearly be advantageous in the woods of eastern North America. There is no evidence that Cornwallis was anticipating conflict there at this time. Nevertheless, such tactics were to prove fortuitously very foresighted, and was the start, in fact, of a lifelong belief Cornwallis had in the value of light infantry. The adoption of these light infantry tactics also refutes, I think, the oft-held assumption by American writers that the British Army arrived in America ill-prepared for the type of warfare it would experience there. Now, as already mentioned, Cornwallis had few qualms about serving in America and made a point of volunteering for service there on learning that the government was planning to send an expedition from Britain in late 1775 to assist the Southern Loyalists. His offer was quickly accepted, though the actual command was given to Sir Henry Clinton, about whom I will say a little more in a minute. The expedition itself came to nothing due to poor intelligence, and the troops eventually left the Carolinas in late June 1776 to assist Sir William Howe in his assault on New York. Still a volunteer, albeit a newly promoted Major General, Cornwallis played a relatively minor role with the Reserve Corps for much of the campaign around New York. However, once Howe had secured Manhattan, he decided to entrust Cornwallis in mid-November 1776 with the task of securing eastern New Jersey as far as Brunswick. Despite the claims of many authors that Washington engineered a miraculous escape for his army after abandoning Fort Lee, the British pursuit under Cornwallis was in fact a leisurely affair, in line with Howe's determination to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The distance between Fort Lee and Brunswick is about 45 miles, and Cornwallis began his advance on the 23rd of November, but only arrived at his destination on the 1st of December. That's averaging just 5 miles a day. When the Hessian officer Johann Ewald suggested a more vigorous pursuit, Cornwallis replied, Let them go, my dear Ewell, and stay here. We do not want to lose any men. One Jaeger Hessian rifleman is worth more than 10 rebels. Ewell noted in the privacy of his diary that he now understood the reason for the slow pace of Howe's operations. He wanted to spare the king's subjects and hoped to terminate the war amicably. And he was strengthened in his assumption the next day by several English officers. Why waste men when Washington's army was disintegrating? Well, of course, the expectation of a leisurely end to the war was to be dramatically challenged by Washington's crossings of the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, and again on the 30th of December, which threatened British control of New Jersey. The rebellion was clearly not over and enjoyed more support from the population than anticipated. In this crisis, Sir William Howe turned to Cornwallis as the officer best equipped to deal with the situation. Cornwallis was then on board a ship bound for England to be reunited with his wife, Jemima, and their 2 children. But leaping into the saddle and escorted initially by only 3 dragoons, he set off through New Jersey, gathering such men as he could to reinforce the advance guard under Major General James Grant at Princeton. By early 2nd of January 1777, he had some 7,000 men available, more than enough to deal with the ill-equipped troops at Washington's disposal. However, I do not propose to go into the details of the fighting around Trenton and Princeton, which I am sure are well known to you. I think it's sufficient to say that on this occasion, Cornwallis was thoroughly outwitted by his opponent, and he was perhaps, I think, lucky to retain his command. That he did so was due to Howe's support, who disingenuously dismissed Trenton and Princeton as minor engagements when reporting these events to Lord George Germain, the British American Secretary of State for the American colonies. Cornwallis wrote similarly to Germain that the troops had been too dispersed at the conclusion of the recent campaign. Now they were safely concentrated around Brunswick and Perth Amboy, leaving Washington dangerously isolated up Morristown without supplies. And he believed any attempt by the rebel commander to reach safety in Pennsylvania must result in his death. Well, having survived the Trenton and Princeton debacle, Cornwallis was favored by Howe to be his second in command for the expedition to Philadelphia that he was planning for the 1777 campaign. This was much resented by Sir Henry Clinton, who was a more senior officer to Cornwallis, and it was to be the start of a fractious relationship between Clinton and Cornwallis, as we shall see. During the campaign, 1770 campaign itself, Cornwallis certainly restored any loss of reputation from the events of Trenton and Princeton, playing a prominent role in the Battle of the Brandywine and the events that led to the capture of Philadelphia. But any satisfaction, of course, at the fall of the rebel capital was undermined by the news that Burgoyne had been compelled to surrender at Saratoga. Writing to his mother, Cornwallis admitted that that event had greatly changed the face of affairs in this country, and concluded, God only knows how this business will end. Clearly, any prospect of finishing the rebellion quickly with the help of the loyal population was not going to happen. However, Cornwallis had taken solemn oaths to serve his king and country in good times or bad, and he was not about to become a fair-weather soldier. The hope remained that the rebels would recognize that they could never drive Britain from the American continent and must eventually accept the terms now being offered by Lord North's administration. Nevertheless, Saratoga could not but have consequences for the conduct of the war and Cornwallis's role in it. The first consequence was a request from Howe to George III for permission to resign his command, realizing that he could not entirely escape blame for the disaster that had befallen Burgoyne's army. The command accordingly devolved on Clinton, since no other senior officer in England, relished the taking on such a challenging assignment. Another consequence was Cornwallis's promotion to be Clinton's deputy, having recently received the rank of a lieutenant general. But 1778 was to prove a frustrating period for Cornwallis. Now that conciliatory methods had failed, his natural inclination as a commander was to seek out his foe and fight that decisive battle. However, the entry of France into the war necessarily meant a reordering of British priorities. The ministerial focus in 1778 indeed switched to the West Indies as a result of the French entry, because they hoped to capture some of France's rich sugar islands. Another consequence here then was Clinton had to send a substantial part of his army to the Caribbean, with the result that he would not only have to evacuate Philadelphia, but also remain on the defensive in New York. Cornwallis's immediate reaction to this was to request permission to return home. The king, however, refused. Cornwallis must stay in New York. And this left Cornwallis spending the rest of 1778 conducting small raids and foraging operations, much to his dismay. Then, suddenly in November 1778, he learned that his wife Jemima was seriously ill, prompting him to request compassionate leave. Clinton, perhaps happy to see the end of the back of his subordinate, saw no reason to keep his deputy. Once in London, Cornwallis went straight to George III to surrender his commission as second in command in America. George III grudgingly agreed, but only after telling Cornwallis that he just stayed in America, however deep his affection for his wife. Now, Cornwallis's resignation, I think, in these circumstances must well have terminated his military career, limiting his role therefore in the American war to that of a minor participant. So how and why did he return to America? Well, ironically, for the same reason that had prompted him to return to Britain a few weeks earlier, namely the health of his wife. But in mid-February 1779, Jemima Cornwallis died despite every effort to save her. The event affected Cornwallis deeply. Even 8 months later, he confessed to his brother William that Jemima's death had effectively destroyed all my hopes of happiness in this world. The slightest memory of her harrowed up his soul. Like many others in such situation, he looked to travel to alleviate his distress. One option, or the best option, was to request a new military posting, even if this meant returning to America and working with Clinton. As he informed this former commander-in-chief on the 4th of April 1779, although operations in America might have stalled, should Clinton have any initiatives in mind against the southern colonies or the French West Indies, Cornwallis would with great pleasure offer his services. But the main thing was to escape his current torment. This country has no charms for me. I am perfectly indifferent. I'm perfectly indifferent as to what part of the world I go. But he was not seeking personal fame or glory. As he again confided to his brother William Cornwallis, I'm now returning to America, not with views of conquest and ambition, since nothing brilliant can be expended in that quarter. It was simply that I find this country quite insubordinate and must have a change of scenery. But whether these are valid reasons for returning to a conflict which he no longer believed could be won, I'll leave it to you to judge. The result was his departure, nevertheless, in May 1779 from New York, where he arrived in time to take part in the expedition against South Carolina, which Clinton was planning as part of Germain's southern strategy to harness loyalist support there. And of course, there hadn't been any significant operations in the South. Cornwallis was naturally supported this initiative, since it offered a chance of action and an opportunity to forget his personal grief. It also opened the possibility that British fortunes might revive in more fertile ground. The expeditionary force left New York on the 26th of December 1779, first establishing bases to the south of Charleston before crossing the Ashley River at the end of March 1780, to begin the divestment of the city itself, which finally capitulated on the 11th of May 1780. It was a stunning success and important for what accompanied it, namely the apparent readiness of the population to accept British rule once more. Seemingly, Clinton, with Cornwallis's assistance, had discovered a winning formula for restoring British authority. Now, shortly after the surrender, Clinton heard that the French were sending a task force to North America with New York as their likely objective. The news prompted Clinton, therefore, to return, leaving Cornwallis to complete the pacification of South Carolina. And Cornwallis's orders were therefore to pacify South Carolina. And then after that had been achieved, he was to try and repeat the process of rolling back the rebellion by entering North Carolina. This was Cornwallis's first experience, a real experience, I think, of having an independent command, and he was determined to make the most of it. Being more optimistic now that the war might turn out better than he had previously expected. Writing to his brother William on the 4th of July, he commented, "The province of South Carolina has totally submitted, and American affairs wear a better aspect than they have done for some time. Most promisingly, the people of the backcountry seem most sincerely happy at returning to their union with Great Britain and execrate the tyranny of their late rulers." In reality, the situation was nothing like as stable as Cornwallis believed. Within a couple of weeks of writing this, there was an upsurge of partisan activity led by Thomas Sumter and Francis Marion, who were seemingly encouraged by their activities by the news that 2,000 Continentals had arrived in North Carolina and that an even greater number of Virginia militia were marching on behind. Clearly, the rebels were intent on restarting the war in both North and South Carolina. Well, Cornwallis's natural reaction was to strike this looming menace before he was attacked. Taking the initiative always offered better prospects than remaining on the defensive. The result, of course, was the Battle of Camden on the 16th of August, 1780, in which Cornwallis gained a total victory over the rebel forces of Horatio Gates, making him once again hopeful, as he informed Germain, that the internal commotions and insurrections in the province will now subside. Unfortunately, these two hopes too were quickly dispelled as arrests broke out in the area between the Santee and Pd rivers, requiring the immediate dispatch of forces there. Nevertheless, Cornwallis determined to press on with the next stage of the British plan to recover the southern colonies, and by advancing into North Carolina, where widespread loyal support was promised. He was convinced in any case that the unrest in South Carolina would never subside until its northern neighbor was subdued. Equally, peace could not be achieved there until rebel supplies from Virginia were severed. It was for this reason that he simultaneously therefore requested Clinton to deploy forces in Virginia as well, to send a separate task force there. And I suppose you could say Cornwallis' mentality was perhaps not entirely dissimilar to that of American strategies during the Vietnam War, where it was argued that the Viet Cong could only be defeated if their supply lines through Laos and Cambodia were first severed. With these views in mind, Cornwallis entered across the border into North Carolina on the 7th September 1780 in his first attempt to invade to subdue the province. However, he was quickly disappointed in these hopes again, certainly of widespread loyalist help, since little was forthcoming. Then his maverick subordinate, Major Patrick Ferguson, managed to become surrounded with his militia at King's Mountain, resulting in the loss of his entire command. This setback, allied to widespread malaria among the troops, which affected Cornwallis himself, necessitated a return to South Carolina. And Cornwallis's cup of woe, of course, was completed shortly after Christmas by an even worse setback at Cowpens, in which the headstrong Bannister Tarleton, was thoroughly outmaneuvered by the wily Daniel Morgan. It might be wondered in these discouraging circumstances why Cornwallis persevered in his campaign to invade North Carolina. Well, firstly, as I've already mentioned, his natural inclination was to attack. Secondly, a defensive war would give the initiative to the enemy, allowing him to launch attacks across the North Carolina border at will, reigniting the pockets of rebellion which had never been extinguished even at the height of British success there. Finally, Cornwallis had succumbed, like Clinton, to the idea that one big battle against the enemy's principal regular force was the key to success. Clinton, of course, it was the army of George Washington that must be destroyed, while for Cornwallis, it was the Continental forces now commanded by Nathaniel Greene. Their armies were the beacon that sustained this unnatural rebellion. To give his army extra maneuverability, Cornwallis decided to burn his supply train, except for the wagons containing rum, salt, ammunition, and hospital stores. And this required the destruction of all non-essential possessions. The officers, as you may know, often travel with an extensive wardrobe. These now all had to be burnt, Cornwallis himself setting the example, which, according to Brigadier Charles O'Hara, was cheerfully followed by all the officers. Then, as O'Hara commented later in a famous quote, "Without baggage, necessaries, or provisions of any sort for officer or soldier, in the most barren, inhospitable, unhealthy part of North America, equipped only with zeal and bayonets, it was resolved to follow Greene's army to the end of the world." The result, as you know, for the British at least, was a wild goose chase around North Carolina, which ended eventually for Cornwallis in the Pyrrhic victory of Guilford Courthouse. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of that event, except to observe that the battle certainly stretched Cornwallis's command to the absolute limit. As he shortly confessed to his friend William Phillips, "We had not a regiment or corps that did not at some time give way, and that included the prestigious Brigade of Guards." So, with little sign of loyalist support, and with his army severely depleted and in want of food and clothing, Cornwallis had little option but to retreat to Wilmington on the coast of North Carolina to await supplies and give his men time to recuperate. You know, as he now currently had barely 1,300 men fit for service. Then, having recuperated, he would be able to more effectively decide how to resume the campaign. Cornwallis reached Wilmington on the 7th of April, 1781. Here he received news that Clinton was sending a further 2,500 troops to Virginia under Phillips to reinforce Benedict Arnold, who had been sent there in response to Cornwallis's earlier request to cut off the flow of supplies to the Carolina rebels. This meant that the forces in Virginia now numbered close to 4,500 men, double the number at Wilmington, prompting Cornwallis to consider afresh how the war might be conducted, as he informed Phillips. Perhaps, he mused, Virginia should be made the center of operations, even to the extent of abandoning New York, since such redeployment offered the British the best chance of recovering the southern colonies. And he repeated these ideas on the 10th of April to Clinton. Until Virginia is in a manner subdued, our hold of the Carolinas must be difficult, if not precarious. And he was encouraged in this thinking by the news that Lord Rawdon, his deputy in South Carolina, had recently repulsed attacks by Sumter and Marion. Then on the 15th of April, Cornwallis received reports that Nathaniel Greene too was changing his plans and was marching southwards to challenge Rawdon for the control of South Carolina. This made it imperative for Cornwallis to take the field again. He had at this point two options: either to follow Greene to reinforce the British position in South Carolina, or alternatively to march northwards into Virginia to join Phillips. If he did the latter, the two of them could then interdict the flow of supplies to the southern rebels and perhaps force Greene to retrace his steps. Tired of endlessly marching around the Carolinas, Cornwallis perhaps understandably chose the latter course. He believed he had good operational reasons for not following Greene, as he explained to Germain. The distance from Wilmington to Camden, the want of forage and subsistence on the greatest part of the road, the difficulty of passing the P.D. River when opposed by an enemy, all render it impossible for me to give any immediate assistance. Rawdon, therefore, for the moment, must fend for himself. Cornwallis' army accordingly left Wilmington on the 25th of April, 1781, marching by of Halifax, where he was reassured to hear on the 12th of May that Rawdon had defeated Greene 2 weeks earlier at Hobkirk's Hill. A couple of days later, he then heard that Phillips and Arnold were in fact expecting Cornwallis at Petersburg in Virginia. And seemingly, therefore, Cornwallis could begin a new and more promising phase in the campaign to retake the southern colonies. Well, unfortunately for Cornwallis, his hopes of fighting a more offensive and effective war in Virginia was soon to be dashed. He had overlooked the fact that Virginia was much closer to New York than the Carolinas, and thus gave Clinton the ability to exercise much closer control over Cornwallis's operations. Commander-in-Chief in any case was not pleased with his subordinate, and he heard about his march into Virginia, believing he had disobeyed orders of going into Virginia, thereby putting the British control of South Carolina in jeopardy. He also castigated Cornwallis for suggesting that the British abandon New York. Accordingly, he ordered Cornwallis instead was first to establish a base in Virginia to protect the British forces there in case the French entered the Chesapeake. Then the rest of Cornwallis's army should be sent back to New York, because Clinton was again worried about his own position, having received intelligence about the Wethersfield conference that Washington and Rochambeau had held in Connecticut, planning with their plan to attack New York. Clearly, that city was where decisive action was going to occur. Well, establishing a static post in Virginia and confining his operations to minor raids to steal a little tobacco, as he put it, was the antithesis of the kind of warfare that Cornwallis had suggested and wanted to pursue. But he also believed such plan of a base was both dangerous and pointless, telling Clinton on the 30th of June, "I submit it to your Excellency's consideration whether it is worthwhile to hold a sickly defensive post in this bay, which will always be exposed to a sudden French attack and makes no diversion in favor of the Southern Army." He would much prefer in these circumstances to return to South Carolina, where Rawdon's health was giving a cause for concern. "As I came to America with no other view than to endeavor to be useful to my country, and as I do not think it possible to render any service in a defensive situation here, I am willing to repair to Charleston if you approve of it. In the meantime, he would do as Clinton desired, assemble the necessary shipping for sending a portion of his army back to New York. Well, Clinton quickly rejected the idea of Cornwallis's return to South Carolina. Equally, he rejected his proposal, his concern about holding a base in Virginia. He was, in any case, Clinton was now reassured from that Sir George Rodney in the West Indies with the British fleet would take care of any visit if the French did come up to the Chesapeake. Therefore, a search for a suitable site for both the now Army and Navy should be continued. Now, the British already held Portsmouth at the tip of Chesapeake Bay. However, it was unsuitable for the larger ships of war, and it also lay in flat open country, meaning it had very few defensive capabilities. Now, Clinton himself had previously suggested Williamsburg or Yorktown, though Cornwallis was able to quickly rule these out. Williamsburg, in the first place, was not on the river, while Yorktown, to quote, far exceeds our power consistent with your plans to make safe defensive posts there and at Gloucester, both of which would be necessary for the protection of shipping. Clinton again begged to disagree on the advice of Arnold about the resources needed to establish a base at Yorktown and Gloucester. But he agreed to consult the naval officers in New York for their views on what was the best site. And this, I think, was the fatal decision regarding the British cause in Virginia, the decision to place his base at Yorktown, have this base at Yorktown. Now, the background to Clinton's insistence on a base with a joint naval and military facility lay in the Royal Navy's long dissatisfaction with New York, which had up to this point had been its principal station in North American waters. The naval officers' first objection was that the sandbars at the entrance to New York frequently damaged the keels of the larger ships, the ships of the line. But the harbor was also prone to freeze in winter, immobilizing the vessels and making them vulnerable to land attack. This latter danger was demonstrated graphically at the end of 1779, when exceptionally cold weather froze the harbor waters to such a degree as to support the heaviest cannon. The possession of an ice-free anchorage thus and deep water port had obvious appeal for the Navy, and Clinton was more than ready to facilitate the naval establishment at this point. Now, a new fleet commander, Thomas Graves, had arrived, replacing Marriott Arbuthnot, Admiral Arbuthnot, with whom Clinton had had a long-running series of disagreements. The change of naval command made Clinton readier to accommodate his naval colleagues. As he duly informed Cornwallis, both services therefore agreed it was absolutely necessary we should hold a station in the Chesapeake for ships of the line as well as frigates. Graves suggested perhaps Hampton Road as an option, though inspection quickly ruled this out, since any anchorage there offered minimal protection to the vessels using it. And this, as a result, left Cornwallis with little choice but to fortify Yorktown and Gloucester, being the only harbour capable, in Cornwallis's view, of giving effectual protection to ships, line of battleships. The river there was sufficiently deep for these large vessels, while the 100-foot high banks would partially shield ships anchored underneath. Work accordingly began on the Gloucester side of the river at the beginning of August, and a couple of weeks later on Yorktown itself. However, Cornwallis was no more enamored about Yorktown than during a previous visit in June, describing the location as bad to O'Hara because the flat landscape offered no advantage for a defending force. As he later informed Clinton, The ground in general was so disadvantageous that nothing but the necessity of fortifying it as a post to protect the navy could have induced any person to erect works upon it. His lack of belief in the project therefore led him to suggest that Clinton perhaps should come down to Virginia and take command himself while Cornwallis returned to South Carolina. However, this request too was refused. The scene was thus set for Cornwallis's entrapment and surrender of this army. Time preventing me from going into any details, which again I'm sure are very well known to you. Suffice to say that the French and Americans appeared in overwhelming force, both on land and sea, confounding British assumptions that their forces in Virginia could always be rescued by the Royal Navy. The soft earthworks that Cornwallis had been able to construct in the 6 weeks available to him stood no chance against the massive firepower of the Allied siege train. Now, Tarleton later asserted in his history about the Southern War, asserted that Cornwallis should have attempted to escape by making a forced march either back to South Carolina or New York. However, this would have involved a journey of several hundred miles through hostile territory, pursued by a superior enemy without supplies, while simultaneously abandoning 2,000 sick and wounded, together with 20 transports and several warships. At no time did Clinton authorize such action. Instead, he promised constantly that he was coming to Cornwallis's aid. And Cornwallis had already incurred Clinton's anger about marching into Virginia, and he was not about to offend his commander-in-chief by marching out of Virginia back to South Carolina or wherever. Well, the conquest of Yorktown, of course, meant not only the surrender of Cornwallis's army, but signaled the loss of the war and the recognition of the United States by Britain. Inevitably, this disaster produced widespread anger in Britain, and a search for the culprits who had led the nation to so ignominious an outcome. Inevitably, the North Ministry was the principal target, while it's resulting in its replacement by a Whig government, again headed by Lord Rockingham. But accusations, of course, were levelled widely against many of the military and naval commanders, notably Sir George Rodney, for failing to send sufficient ships from the West Indies to counter the motions of the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse. Secondly, Admiral Graves for failing to defeat Grasse's fleet as it emerged from the Virginia Capes. And thirdly, Sir Henry Clinton for not intercepting the armies of Washington and Rochambeau as they marched through New Jersey. Remarkably, there was little criticism of Cornwallis, and the reason, I think, was, above all, was his popularity with the army, both the officers and the men, and the public perception, the wider public, that he had at least attempted to win the war by going on and trying to engage his enemy. Of course, this is not to say that Cornwallis was entirely blameless for what had happened. He undoubtedly disobeyed Clinton's orders by marching into Virginia instead of returning to protect South Carolina, while his strategy for an offensive war in the former province promised to be his strategy for an offensive war in Virginia promised to be no more successful than British efforts elsewhere in the middle and southern colonies. However, as I've shown, I think he can be absolved for his entrapment at Yorktown, since it was Clinton who insisted on establishing a naval base in Chesapeake for ships of the line, irrespective of the resources required for such a facility or its vulnerability to attack. But again, here it's too simplistic simply to blame one individual like Clinton. Yorktown ultimately was a collective failure by Britain's leaders. Firstly, because they failed to understand the nature of the conflict they were fighting in America. And secondly, because they grossly overestimated Britain's material resources and hence ability to impose its will, certainly after once the France and Spain entered the war. Well, the absolution, the public absolution that York of Cornwallis as responsibility for Yorktown meant that he was one of the few leaders whose career was not terminated by the events of 1781. Within months of returning to England, he was being targeted for the position of Governor General of Bengal, a post to which he eventually accepted in February 1786. Later, he held a key position in William Pitt's cabinet during the French Revolutionary Wars, before being sent to Ireland to end the 1798 rebellion and secure passage of the 1801 Act of Union between those two kingdoms. But these are stories for another time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Middleton. That was fantastic. And we are now going to open up the floor for some questions. So if you would like to ask anything related to Dr. Middleton's talk just now, please submit them through the Q&A function. But I'll go ahead and ask you the first question, Dr. Middleton. It's been 40 years since a biography of Charles Cornwallis. What induced you to write one in 2022 and publish one in 2022? Was there something that sparked your interest, or?
Well, I'd become familiar with Cornwallis as an American historian whose field of study was particularly with mid-18th century, the Revolution. So that aspect of his career, and there hadn't been any account of his side of the war. As you know, the vast literature by American authors almost invariably focus on the American, from an American angle. But also, I thought he dropped out of the. Clearly played key roles elsewhere in India. And also I was working and teaching most of my life in Ireland, and necessarily I was kind of, well, I thought it would be interesting to lock horns with some of my Irish colleagues as to, this particular period, the Act of Union and the ending of the 1798 rebellion. So I think the Irish dimension I also found interesting. Yeah, and I just thought he'd fallen out a little bit out of focus. In most of these fields, he deserved. He clearly played a very important role. So. And yeah, I was looking for after I'd finished a brief, in fact, volume on the War of American Independence. I was looking for another project, and I thought, well, Cornwallis, why not? He's interesting. It would offer, it had the American background, some British background, some of the Irish background. The only thing I wasn't really very familiar with and was a novice was, of course, the Indian aspects to his career as Governor General in Bengal.
Fascinating. It's it's always good to bring new light on well-known figures and kind of straighten things out in that regard. Now I'm going to sort of go in sequential order of events here.
Yeah.
You mentioned Cornwallis's letter following the surrender at Saratoga.
Yeah.
We all know that there was a lack of communication between Burgoyne and Howe and Germain. Did that change Cornwallis's view on what was coming over in terms of strategy from London? Did he have a negative or more negative view of Germain and his strategy, and as it progressed throughout the war? How did that affect Cornwallis's view on what was coming over from across the Atlantic?
Well, of course, one of the things Germain, he's often been very criticized for his lack of strategy. This was partly because Germain felt it was up to the generals to. I think there was a lack of clear appreciation of Germain left it to the generals to find a winning strategy, basically. Of course, as you know, I mean, I think Germain was very sensitive. The fact that his career, military career, had earlier ended in disgrace with his court-martial for disobeying the orders of Prince Ferdinand after the battle, during the Battle of Minden. I think this made Germain very tentative about trying to lay down. I mean, I think this may have been one of the problems. He didn't lay down really a clear strategy. He only suggested the commanders, but he undoubtedly did suggest the idea of a southern strategy. But I think it comes back to the British view in a way. They just assume despite all the evidence to the contrary, that the colonists, they would ultimately, the loyalty was still there, and they only had to appear and it would reassert itself. That is one of the conundrums, that they just never seem to. I mean, as far as people condemning the war, Sir Charles Grey probably came. He'd served with Cornwallis under Howe until 1778. He did tell the Commons basically this was a war that couldn't be won. The countryside was just too, the terrain and whatnot was just too great. Unless you had perhaps 100, he didn't actually put a figure, but the sort of figures and forces that Howe had done. He was defending Howe in a House of Commons. Howe had done his best to bring the war to successful conclusion, but it was impossible. It was just the countryside was too vast, the people too opposed to the resumption of British rule. But the British establishment just somehow, a bit like Putin, cannot accept that the Ukraine isn't part of Russia.
Sure, absolutely.
American colonies just had to be, the loyalty would resurface.
Can definitely draw some parallels there. Absolutely. Now, following Saratoga, we know that the French get involved and we have some foreign intervention coming in now. Mm-hmm. We obviously know Cornwallis's thoughts at the latter stages of the war at Yorktown with the French, but what were his thoughts when the French initially got involved, or the Spanish for that matter? Did that change his mindset at all, or affect his strategy in any way?
I have to say that the Cornwallis, there's almost very little Cornwallis correspondence until he takes up the command in South Carolina. He doesn't really, on his grasping at snippets, but I think he understood the reason why resources had to be diverted to the West Indies, and that perhaps the war in America, and that's why he wanted to come back home and take up a command. I think he would certainly willingly, and indeed, he was willing to serve in the West Indies. And indeed, in 1779, when he first arrived back in America after the death of his wife, there was a threat to Jamaica, and Clinton answered the call of the governor of Jamaica to send an expeditionary force out to and Cornwallis off to take command, which was accepted. They were only a few days at sea when the news came in. It was a false rumor. The Spanish were not about to attack Jamaica, and Cornwallis had to, But I think you were touching on something very significant, that there really was a lack of military historians always looking for strategy and etc., grand strategy. There's really a significant lack of any, people actually sitting down and thinking about how war should be fought and how you went about them. Really quite remarkable. I mean, there are no von Clausewitz's writing, on the how to fight the perfect war, how to deal with the challenges of conflict. People just read what military history or accounts there were, and the experience of as they picked it as they went along. But strategy in the way that we really doesn't, in my view, is notable by its absence.
Interesting. Okay. Now, getting onto more of Cornwallis's thoughts, we've had a lot of questions on his thoughts on General Washington throughout the war. Was it one view? Did Washington, as the war progressed, change his opinion, Cornwallis's opinion on Washington? Were there any particular officers of the Continental Army that Cornwallis despised or respected? Can you elaborate more on that?
Well, they certainly, as far as Washington was concerned, I mean, after the surrender, of course, the courtesies of 18th century warfare, it was the custom for the victors to invite the vanquished to a sumptuous dinner. The officers, I should say, not the rank and file. They were, in fact, it must have been quite tedious for Cornwallis, because yes, he didn't actually go to the surrender day because he was, I think, the malaria. He was clearly suffering from malaria and had malaria. But there were this series of dinners. Washington hosted one, which Cornwallis didn't go to, and O'Hara deputized for him. And then there was another dinner. Rochambeau had one, so it went on. Now, one of these dinners, I forget which one, that Cornwallis apparently got up and said that, praised Washington and said that he would be remembered not for Yorktown in future generations, but people would say, it was his performance, Washington's performance at Trenton and Princeton, that people would remember him on as what had saved the American cause. So he was very complimentary, and clearly he admired. But again, the lack of sources. Cornwallis didn't much introspection. He got on, he'd done his best, and he got on with life, and he wasn't constantly looking back. Occasionally, in his Indian correspondence, he refers to events that had happened in America and lessons to be learnt, but he's not looking back, and he's getting on with what he's got, the current task in hand. He's always looking forwards. Okay.
How about any other American officers? I know, he referred to Lafayette as the boy, and there were a few occurrences where he almost bagged Lafayette throughout the war. Can you comment on any other officers that he had respect and admiration or respect for, or just didn't like in general?
No, to be honest, I can't really shed much light on that.
Okay.
I mean, I think clearly he respected the Americans,
Sure.
He recognized, particularly the Continental forces, and obviously he recognized they had produced a very good work army that was formidable as formidable as really as the British Army. So he certainly never underrated his opponents, never. And later, when he went to India, he didn't underrate the ability of Tipu Sultan in his ability to spring surprises.
Very good. Now, I think we have our next question that came in. I think we have the movie The Patriot to thank for this.
All right.
What was his view on the fighting style of Bannister Tarleton in the Southern campaign?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting question. Tarleton is certainly, I think the picture portrays him quite correctly, that Tarleton, believed that it needed to be really, you needed to take out your enemy. Really, it was when he was in South Carolina, he was advocating a policy of fire and sword. he issued on one particular occasion a proclamation saying that unless the inhabitants immediately surrendered their arms and took their oaths of loyalty and promised to be good boys and girls, good boys, he would burn down the plantations. And indeed, he did engage in a number of what we might call atrocities, inhumane war crimes, at least in terms of destroying property. Well, I suppose executing, summary executions. Now, Cornwallis did say to him, he tried to restrain him and said, well, I don't think it's to our advantage in the end that we should completely destroy the country, or even half destroy the country, because this isn't going to win the hearts and minds. This is not what we're here for. We're here to try and protect the loyal and restrain the disloyal, but a policy of fire and sword was not going to achieve that objective. And he admonished Tarleton to be more circumspect in his behaviour. So Tarleton is certainly and there were other British officers. Frederick Mackenzie thought that at the time of the attack on Fort Washington in New York in 1776, that really what the British should have done at that point was to put the entire garrison to the sword. That technically they had refused to surrender. And 18th century, the conventions of 18th century warfare, where you offered your opponent a chance to surrender. If they didn't take that, then you could butcher the enemy, put them to death. And of course that's what Tarleton claimed he had done with Buford's the engagement with Colonel Bufford and the Virginian Regiment, as they were retreating from Charleston.
The Waxhaws.
Waxhaws. Thank you very much. Waxhaws. That was Tarleton's justification. He had offered Bufford a chance to surrender. He had refused. They were going to stand and fight. So be it. If his dragoons then got a little bit out of hand, well, that was the nature of the warfare, and that was justified by the rules of war.
Interesting. Thank you. Our next question, you shed some light on this in the previous question. The myth that, or I should say lore, not lore and myth, that Cornwallis sent O'Hara with his sword to Washington because he was quote unquote sick. You said that he actually, a lot of Americans will translate that into he felt too ashamed to go out there himself, and that has portrayed Cornwallis in a very cowardly light. But you did say he had malaria. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, well, he seemed to have contracted malaria when on the invasion of his first foray into North Carolina in October 1780, about the time of King's Mountain. There was a lot of sickness among the troops, and from historical research I've read, it was either malaria or yellow fever. There was quite a lot of that also present, but I think in the symptoms suggested it was it was malaria, because it then came back. It certainly came back to affect him while he was in the Yorktown siege. His personality, one of the reasons Cornwallis was popular with his troops was that he never, he always suffered there. They had the same diet when they were on campaigning as they were in Carolinas. He had the same diet and bore the same hardships as the common soldiers. And he wasn't a man to avoid. I think, it just seemed completely against his nature that he would have felt too ashamed. Clearly, he was deeply upset with what had happened, but he was not the sort of person who would then shrink around. No, he would have, if he'd been able, falling off. But if he well, because he was supposed to, the defeated army would march to the surrender field, but suffering from malaria and the effects of malaria, would have been, he could not have, he could only been probably carried there on a litter. Well, that's, so that was the reason, but I don't think, he certainly didn't have the sort of timidity not to have gone there and faced Washington. And later on, a couple of days later, when he did feel better, as I say, he did go to the dinners. He did make this commending speech to, or toast to George Washington, and tried to, do what was convention held that, gentlemen and officers ought to be able to do. The idea that he was too ashamed to appear at the field, the surrender field, was bitterly taken up by Sergeant Lamb, some of whom the society may be familiar with his memoirs and journal of the campaigning in North America. And Lamb bitterly asserted that this was an absolute lie, that Cornwallis did not appear because he was too ashamed. It was because he always put himself in the first point of danger or embarrassment, or whatever it was. Cornwallis would lead his men.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you for setting that straight. Now we do have some interest in Clinton. We had what eventually happens to Clinton after all of this?
Well, Clinton, he of course stayed on. He only came back in 1782. Cornwallis was ahead of him by 6 months. Well, thereafter, yes, Clinton arrived back because he felt that Cornwallis's friends, or Cornwallis himself, had been laying all the blame for Yorktown at his door. There's no evidence that Cornwallis himself was spreading any of the. I mean, the public just generally seemed to have taken sides here and held Clinton as one of the guilty men. Sir Henry thereafter, responsibility or culpability did stick in that, he didn't see service again. Although I think, was he offered briefly, he was offered the governorship of Gibraltar. But basically, he comes back, he finds that he's being, in his views, he's being traduced. And he sets to work writing, trying to clear his name and trying constantly to blame Cornwallis. It was Cornwallis's fault why Yorktown was chosen. Initially, he's writing sort of letters under the pseudonym of an old officer, a veteran officer, and he's talked about he's trying to he's very upset about the treatment of his former commander-in-chief. This is Clinton, as I say, pretending to be a disconcerted officer who felt his commander-in-chief had been ill-treated. Then he realized this was having no effect, so then he published a pamphlet in early 1783, taking Cornwallis to charge for having marched into Virginia without permission, and then having, it was his responsibility for having chosen Yorktown, and generally absolving himself from being responsible for that disaster. Then, in fact, Clinton spent the rest of his life trying to prove that Cornwallis was the responsibility. His pamphlets, in fact, Cornwallis did reply initially, a pamphlet, and just once stating his case. But Clinton went on producing more pamphlets, and then right at the end, he produced a very much larger volume on his view of the American War, which was later, has been published, was posthumously or much later, was discovered by William Wilcox, the biographer of Clinton, edited and published, the American Rebellion, with the title. So Clinton, ended his life really, or the remaining part of his career, very dissatisfied, and endlessly still trying to persuade himself that he was not responsible for Yorktown.
Wow. Well, going off of that point, we know the post-Revolutionary War years for Cornwallis were quite different, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
He goes on to become military governor in India. Did his service in America have any impact on how he operated in India? And an additional question to that is, like Clinton, we obviously know that he didn't catch a lot of flack for Yorktown and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Did Cornwallis have any personal sufferings from, or guilt, shame from the events that occurred in America? It's a two-part question. Sorry to overload that.
Yeah. No, I think none at all. He just felt he'd done the best he could, and he was ready to try and embark on a new phase of his life. But lessons from his time in America, I think he became aware that you couldn't win a war the kind of the American war unless you had at least the passive consent of the majority of the population. I think that comes out in Ireland. He recognized you couldn't hold that pressure cooker unless you brought Catholic, at least middle class Catholic people into the political process, and as equals in the Union couldn't succeed. So I think that was one of the very big lessons. And I think even at the back of his mind, in India, of course, Indians didn't look upon Indians in the same way as he looked upon, a bit of a racist, of course, like nearly everyone was in the white people were in the 18th century. But he did feel the Indian people, that the empire, if it was to be consolidated, it must have the passive consent of the population, and you could only do that if you gave them laws or rules, wrote laws and whatnot that secured their property and their lives, and a sort of constitution. They wouldn't be part of the legislative process of how India was governed, but they must be given protection, their lives and property. And and in fact, very ironically, he may even been influenced by the American federal constitution, because he was in drawing up or revising the sort of legal framework, the civil and criminal code in India. He was advised by Sir William Jones, who was an eminent jurist and a student of Asiatic Society of Indian culture, and etc. And Jones was corresponding with Arthur Lee, the American patriot diplomat. And at one particular point, 1788, I think 9 it is, he asks Jones asked Lee, will he send him a copy of the new constitution? He'd very much like to see it. And since Jones and Cornwallis were combined, working closely on this new legal framework for the governance of India, this criminal and civil code, then I think clearly Cornwallis, and they actually a couple of times uses the word constitution when drawing up his new regulations regarding the criminal code. So ironically, Cornwallis seems to have had a little bit of American has rubbed off on him and into the I'll be interested to see if this is picked up at all by Indians, scholars of the Indian subcontinent.
That's fascinating. Well, I think Dr. Middleton, that is a great place to wrap things up, and I want to thank you again for your fantastic presentation today and for taking the time to speak with us from across the pond for 12 o'clock in the afternoon our time. This has been a very well attended program that has generated a lot of interest. So I hope this offers some incentive for people to go out and grab a copy of your book. And that's supposed to hit American shelves very soon, I understand, correct?
Well, over here, anyhow, came out on the 22nd of February. So I assumed it was coming out simultaneously in America itself. Yeah. So
I think it's
basically,
middle to end of March over here for us. So,
yeah.
but I
All right.
this
Okay. That
offers
may
some
be
incentive to go out and get some grab some
copies. Well,
copies. Yes, absolutely.
I'm reminded of the Beatles. They asked, have you got a message for your American fans? And they replied, yeah, buy more records.
There you go. Buy more books.
Buy more books.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for taking the time.
Yeah.
Very much.
And thank you very much indeed for this opportunity.
Absolutely. Now, before we officially conclude today's program, I would like to point out that as you leave, there will be a Google survey that will appear on your screen, and we kindly ask that you share your thoughts about today's program, as well as any other suggestions you have for topics that you would like us to cover in future programming. As always, your feedback is most helpful as we develop that future programming calendar. I would also like to invite you to visit the events page on our website, AmericanRevolutionInstitute.org, where you can learn more about our upcoming historical programs. Our next historical program this month is a virtual lecture that will be held on Zoom Thursday, March 10th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and will feature historian Katie Gedder Turner discussing the Siege of Boston and the impact that it had on the civilian population of Boston. Registration is currently open for that program, along with all of our other future historical programs. So with that, on behalf of the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, thank you, Dr. Middleton, and thank you everyone out there for joining us today, wherever you are, and for your continued support of our mission. I wish you all a good day. Until next time, take care.